London is wrapped in fog, and where others see chaos, he finds the truth. The legendary detective Sherlock Holmes is back in the game. Welcome to the channel. Put on your headphones and unravel new mysteries alongside him. It was upon a dreary evening in the early spring of 1893 that I found myself once again at Baker Street, drawn by the familiar magnetic force that had so often lured me from my domestic quiet into the realm of adventure and deduction. The lamps glowed through the fog like muted stars, and as I ascended the well-known steps, I saw the yellow gleam from the sitting room window, which told me that Sherlock Holmes was at home. He greeted me with that quick, incisive nod, which was his habit when his mind was engaged upon a matter of importance. The air of the room was dense with smoke from his long clay pipe, and upon the table lay the scattered fragments of newspapers, chemical bottles, and a letter, much handled, and now spread open before him. "My dear Watson," said he, waving me to my accustomed chair, "you arrive at a moment of interest. I have before me a case which promises to present some curious features, though whether it will rise to the level of the remarkable or sink into the trivial remains to be seen." I smiled. "That, Holmes, is a formula I have heard before. I take it we are once more on the verge of some adventure." He pushed the letter toward me. "Read that and tell me your impressions." It was written in a neat, feminine hand. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, Baker Street, London. Sir, I beg that you will grant me an interview at your earliest convenience. My uncle, Colonel Archibald Fanshawe, met his death 3 nights ago under circumstances which the local police have chosen to dismiss as an unfortunate accident. I cannot reconcile myself to their conclusion. My uncle was a man of courage, not easily swayed by superstition, and I am persuaded that there is more here than meets the eye. I shall call upon you at 11 o'clock tomorrow morning. Yours faithfully, Clara Fanshawe." I laid the letter down. An accident dismissed too readily, perhaps. But what is the peculiar feature, Holmes? He steepled his long fingers. "The lady's uncle died while fulfilling a wager, Watson. A wager that he could pass the night alone in a house reputed to be haunted. He was found dead the next morning, locked from the inside." "Locked?" I exclaimed. "Then suicide must have been suspected." Indeed it was. Yet the post-mortem found traces of prussic acid, hydrogen cyanide, and there was no means by which he could have administered it to himself. The window fastenings were secure, the door barred from within. A candle had burned nearly to the socket beside him. That is all the police have reported." Holmes rose and moved restlessly about the room. "A haunted house, a wager, and a death without visible cause. Our old friends, coincidence and credulity, seem to be conspiring again. Yet the matter has a flavor of deliberation that interests me greatly." At that moment, Mrs. Hudson announced Miss Clara Fanshawe. A young lady entered, tall, pale, with a quiet determination about her that made one forget the traces of recent grief upon her face. She carried herself with the composed bearing of one accustomed to discipline, and there was something soldierly in the lift of her chin. "Mr. Holmes," she began without preamble, "I thank you for receiving me. My uncle's death has been set down to folly, but I know it was not so. He was the bravest of men, and the idea that he could have poisoned himself out of fear is intolerable." Holmes bowed slightly. "You must tell us everything, Miss Fanshawe." Begin, if you please, with the wager itself." She clasped her hands tightly. It was a jest among his acquaintances at the Kent Club. My uncle, you see, was a soldier, retired, but fond of adventure. Sir Lionel Graves wagered him £50 that he would not dare spend the night alone in the old grange at Harrowfield. The house has been empty these 10 years, and country gossip says it is haunted. My uncle accepted at once, laughing at their fears. He took with him a lamp, some cigars, and a revolver. He was found dead at dawn, seated in a chair before the hearth, the lamp extinguished and the revolver undischarged. Watson could not repress an exclamation. And there was no sign of intrusion. None. The windows were latched, the door locked from within, the key still in the lock. The police broke it open. Holmes regarded her keenly. "You said he was poisoned?" "Yes. The coroner found cyanide in his system, yet there was no bottle, no glass, nothing by which it could have been taken." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Fascinating. And what of Sir Lionel Graves?" Her lips tightened. "He was deeply grieved, or so he said. But I cannot forget that he had lost heavily to my uncle in cards. It was he who proposed the wager." Holmes inclined his head. "And others present?" "Only my uncle's secretary, Mr. Edward Lansing, a quiet, capable man, soon to be my fiancé." I thought I saw a quick flash of interest cross Holmes's features, but he merely said, "You may rely upon us, Miss Fanshawe. We shall begin our inquiries at once." As she departed, Holmes turned to me with sudden energy. "Watson, we go to Kent by the morning train. There is something in this affair that calls to me, something more than the shadow of superstition. A locked room, a poison without a vessel, a wager for a night's courage. These are the bones of a mystery worth our attention." I looked at him, his eyes bright beneath the lamplight, and knew that the quiet of Baker Street was over for the moment. Another adventure, strange, perilous, and absorbing, had begun. The following morning broke grey and damp, with a drizzle that blurred the outlines of the city and lent a certain melancholy to our departure. Holmes was in excellent spirits, however, pacing the platform of Charing Cross with that nervous energy which, in him, always heralded the thrill of the chase. He carried nothing but his small black travelling bag, yet I knew that within it lay a collection of chemical files, a magnifying lens, and other instruments of his curious trade. We reached Harrowfield shortly after noon. The countryside was a flat expanse of meadows and sparse woodland, through which the grey silhouette of Harrowfield Grange rose, lonely and forbidding against the horizon. The station master, a weather-beaten man with a rustic accent, touched his cap when we inquired for directions. "You'll find the old grange about a mile beyond the village, sir," said he. "Queer business, that death. Never believed in ghosts myself, but they say no man can spend a night there and keep his wits." Holmes smiled faintly. "Let us hope my nerves will endure the test, should I be compelled to do so." We took the hired trap that awaited us and drove along the winding lane. The house came into view suddenly, a vast, square building of stone with shuttered windows and ivy clinging like dark lace across its face. Even in daylight, it had an air of desolation that chilled the spirit. Holmes surveyed it keenly as we approached. "Observe, Watson, the heavy shutters, the narrow chimneys, the unkept grounds. No caretaker has lived here for years. It is the very stage for a crime masquerading as superstition. At the gates, we were met by Inspector Foley of the local constabulary, a square-shouldered man of middle years, whose manner combined official caution with a rustic frankness. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, glad to see you, sir," said he. "Though I fear you'll find little to puzzle you here. The old colonel was a fool to take such a wager, locked himself in, and somehow, Lord knows how, managed to poison himself. No marks of struggle, no intruder." Holmes's eyes twinkled. "I am much obliged for your summary, Inspector. Nevertheless, I should like to see the room." We entered the Grange. Dust lay thick upon the furniture, and the stale air seemed untouched since the night of the tragedy. Foley led us up the great staircase and along a corridor whose portraits stared down at us through veils of grime. He stopped at a heavy oaken door upon which the key still hung. "That's the place," said he. "We forced it open that morning. The lock's been mended since." Holmes stooped, examined the keyhole, and then entered. It was a large, gloomy chamber with a high ceiling and a single window looking upon the garden. A chair stood near the cold hearth, and upon the table beside it was the remains of a candle burned nearly to the socket. The air still bore a faint, bitter tang that I recognized with a start. Cyanide. "Where was the body found?" Holmes asked quietly. Foley pointed. "Seated there, sir, just as if he'd fallen asleep." Holmes bent over the chair, then began his minute examination. His movements were deliberate, his grey eyes darting from object to object. The window latch, the candlestick, the rug, even a small dark stain upon the table. "Watson," said he, "come here. What do you make of this?" He indicated a thin metallic glimmer half hidden beneath the chair leg. I stooped and drew it out. It was a silver coin, oddly bright amidst the surrounding dust. "A half-crown," I said. Holmes took it with a satisfied nod. "Precisely. Yet look, there is no dust upon it. It has been recently placed." He weighed it on his palm. "Strange. A coin dropped in such a spot should bear the same patina as its surroundings. I fancy this was not left here by accident." He moved next to the candlestick. "Now this, Watson, is more promising still. Observe the base, scratched as if tampered with." He unscrewed the socket delicately. From within, he drew a small brass pin, hollow as a tube. "Ingenious," he murmured. "The poison was delivered perhaps by means of this very candle." Foley gave a skeptical grunt. "You mean someone rigged the candlestick to give off poison gas? Far-fetched, Mr. Holmes." Holmes smiled thinly. "Less far-fetched than a man poisoning himself without a vessel, Inspector. We shall test it later. For the moment, tell me, who had access to this room before the wager?" "No one, sir. It's been locked for years." "Then who possessed the key?" "Sir Lionel Graves had it. He keeps the Grange in trust for the Fanshawe estate." Holmes made a note in his pocketbook. "And Sir Lionel was present at the club when the wager was made?" "He was, sir, along with the Colonel's secretary, Mr. Edward Lansing." Holmes turned to me. "Watson, you recall Miss Fanshawe's account. Sir Lionel, burdened with debt, and Mr. Lansing, who would inherit through her. Two men with possible motives, and both linked to the wager." I nodded gravely. Holmes paced the room, his long fingers clasped behind his back. "The arrangement is almost too neat. A wager contrived to place the victim in isolation, in a setting prearranged by another. Yet there is one factor that troubles me: the locked door. The murderer must have known that the death, if discovered, would be called supernatural. It is deception atop deception. He paused before the window and examined the latch closely. See here, Watson. Minute scratches near the hinge, as though a wire had been passed through from without. Then someone entered by this window? Possibly, but I think rather they wished to make it appear so. Every trace here has been calculated to mislead. Holmes replaced the coin beneath the chair, straightened and said abruptly, "We must speak with Sir Lionel Graves. There is something to be learned from a man who wagers on the courage of others." Outside, the rain had ceased, and a thin mist rose from the fields. We drove to Sir Lionel's estate, a handsome Georgian house overlooking the valley. He received us in a drawing room fragrant with cigars, his manner affable but watchful. "Terrible affair, gentlemen," he declared, pressing Holmes's hand warmly. "Poor Fanshawe, a fine fellow but far too rash. I'd have given £100 to call off that foolish wager." Holmes regarded him levelly. "Indeed? Yet it was you, I believe, who proposed it." Sir Lionel coloured faintly. Merely as a jest, he took it seriously. Holmes's gaze drifted about the room. "You kept the key to the Grange, I understand." Yes. I gave it to him myself the evening of the wager. He returned it, or rather, it was found upon his person." Holmes nodded. "Tell me, Sir Lionel, have you heard any rumours among your acquaintances of ghosts, apparitions, strange noises in the Grange?" Sir Lionel laughed uneasily. "Nonsense, my dear sir. Rustic superstition. Still, I suppose every old house must have its tale." Holmes's tone was mild, but his eyes were piercing. "And the secretary, Mr. Lansing, where might we find him?" "At my stables, I believe. He came down to help arrange the Colonel's effects." Holmes rose. "Then I think, Sir Lionel, we shall not detain you longer." As we drove away, I said, "You suspect him?" Holmes shook his head. "I suspect everyone until I understand everything. But the silver coin, that coin, Watson, it will speak before long. There is method in this masquerade of haunting, and before another day is done, we shall glimpse the face behind the mask." We found Mr. Edward Lansing in the stables behind Sir Lionel's residence, superintending the packing of several trunks. He was a man of about 30, tall and of singularly composed manner, with a pale, thoughtful face that suggested more the scholar than the secretary. His attire was neat, his speech refined, yet there was a nervous flicker in his eyes when Holmes presented his card. "Ah, Mr. Holmes," said he quietly, "Miss Fanshawe mentioned that she had written to you. A dreadful business, is it not? The Colonel was the truest gentleman I have ever served." Holmes inclined his head. "You were with him on the evening the wager was made?" "Yes, indeed. I tried to dissuade him, but he laughed at me. He said, 'Lansing, if I die of fright, it will serve me right for being a fool.' Those were his very words." "And after he entered the Grange, what did you do?" "I remained with Sir Lionel and 2 others at the Kent Club until after midnight. We had agreed not to disturb the Colonel until morning. At daybreak, when he did not return, Sir Lionel and I went to the house. We found the door locked and, well, you know the rest." Holmes studied the man for several moments, then said, "You appear deeply affected, Mr. Lansing." The secretary's expression softened. "He was more than an employer, Mr. Holmes. He treated me as a son." "Indeed. And Miss Fanshawe?" She too was fond of him, I believe? Lansing looked away. She adored him. His death has broken her heart. Holmes's voice was gentle. Yet her loss may soon be repaired, for I understand you are shortly to be married. Lansing's eyes darted up, startled. Yes, that was the plan. Though now, I fear such happiness must be postponed. Holmes gave a slight nod, and I, who had been watching the man's hands, noticed that one of them trembled slightly upon the back of a chair. Did you know of any enmity between the Colonel and Sir Lionel Graves? Holmes continued. None that I ever perceived. They had their differences, but nothing serious. Ah, differences. Only over money matters, Lansing admitted reluctantly. Sir Lionel was not a careful man with his fortune, and the Colonel, who abhorred debt, often reproved him. Yet they were friends to the last. Holmes's tone grew softer still. One last question, Mr. Lansing. Did you ever enter the Grange before that night? Never. Holmes rose, his grey eyes contemplative. Thank you. I shall not trouble you further for the present. As we walked back toward the village, I said, He seems sincere enough. Holmes smiled faintly. He seems many things, my dear Watson, but sincerity is not always a guarantee of innocence. Still, he has given me two small threads upon which to draw, money and opportunity. He quickened his pace. Before we leave this neighborhood, I must speak with the village chemist. We found the little apothecary shop on the main street of Harrowfield, its shelves lined with neat rows of bottles, and its counter presided over by a plump, spectacled man who greeted us with rustic cordiality. Holmes inquired, as though in idle conversation, whether he had recently sold any prussic acid. The chemist shook his head. Not in the last 6 months, sir. I keep only small quantities and always require a written order. But wait a moment. There was one gentleman who asked for some a fortnight ago. I refused him, of course. Holmes's eyes sharpened. Indeed. Can you recall his appearance? Tall, fair, clean-shaven, well-dressed, looked like a gentleman. I remember because he seemed annoyed when I told him the regulations. He said he would send his man for it later, but no one came. Holmes's brows lifted. Would this gentleman, by chance, resemble Sir Lionel Graves? The chemist considered. Now you mention it, there's a likeness, though I wouldn't swear to it. Holmes thanked him, and we took our leave. As we walked, I said, So, you think Graves attempted to procure the poison himself? I think someone wished it known that he had tried, said Holmes grimly. The net of appearances is tightening, but it may yet be of another's weaving. When we returned to the inn, Holmes spread before him the sketches he had made of the room at the Grange. His quick mind was at work, leaping from clue to clue with that peculiar energy which always left me in awe. Watson, said he suddenly, recall the silver coin. Its brightness denotes recent handling. Suppose it had been placed not before, but after the Colonel's death. By the murderer? Precisely. A token, perhaps. One with meaning. If it were dropped by accident, the dust upon it would match that of the room. Yet it shone as though newly polished. I have seen such a device before. In India, during the mutiny. The thugs, those secret murderers, would sometimes leave a coin upon their victim as a sign of revenge or payment rendered. You think it's symbolic? Perhaps. Or perhaps it was meant to suggest theft, though nothing was missing. Either way, it was planted. He paused, tapping his fingers upon the table. Then there is the candlestick. The hollow pin is no accident. Imagine, Watson, a candle laced with cyanide in the wick or base. As it burns, the poison vapor fills the room, invisible, deadly. The colonel, seated before the fire, inhales it gradually and dies without a struggle. I shuddered. Horrible. Yes, but ingenious. Only a man of knowledge and access could contrive such a thing. The secretary fits that description better than Sir Lionel. You suspect Lansing now? I suspect that he is far cleverer than he appears. He had means. The candle could have been placed there while assisting in the wages arrangements. Motive? He inherits indirectly through Miss Fanshawe. And opportunity? He was among the first to discover the body. Holmes rose and paced. Still, I lack proof. There remains one crucial question. How was the room secured from within? He paused at the window and stared into the darkening street. If the door was locked, the key in the inside, the window fastened, then either the killer was a magician or he arranged for the illusion of a lock. An illusion? Consider, the key was found in the lock, yes, but might not that lock have been tampered with, made to appear fastened when it was not? I must examine it again tonight, Watson, by lantern light and alone. That night, while the village slept, we made our way once more to Harrowfield Grange. The mist clung low upon the fields, muffling sound and sight alike. Within, the great house seemed to breathe the chill of the grave. Holmes moved swiftly, his lantern throwing long, distorted shadows upon the walls. He knelt at the door and studied the lock. From his pocket, he drew a thin wire and inserted it delicately. There was a faint metallic click. As I thought, he whispered. The bolt does not engage fully. It can be drawn from without by a fine thread through the keyhole. A simple trick, but effective enough to deceive the unwary. He rose, his eyes bright with triumph. We are close now, Watson. The mechanism of the crime lies bare before us. Only the motive must be brought to light. Tomorrow we shall invite our suspects to Baker Street. And there, I fancy, the truth will emerge like a snake from its hole. And as we left that grim house behind, I could not shake the feeling that we were being watched, that among the shadows someone moved silently, tracking our every step. The following day found us once more within the familiar surroundings of Baker Street, the soot-stained windows dim with the haze of London's late afternoon. Holmes had been silent throughout the journey from Kent, his lean figure half reclined in the corner of the railway carriage, his hawk-like profile turned toward the blurred countryside. Not once did he reach for his pipe. I knew well that he was reconstructing each detail in that extraordinary mind of his, fitting fact to inference as an architect sets stone upon stone. When at last we entered our rooms, he went straight to the mantel, filled his pipe, and sat before the fire in profound contemplation. I, accustomed to his moods, waited until the first curling wreath of smoke signaled that his thoughts had begun to find expression. "Watson," said he, "we stand at the threshold of a singularly delicate case. The evidence, though scant, bears a stamp of calculation too precise for accident. Our dead colonel was no victim of superstition. He was the victim of intelligence. The only question is, whose intelligence?" He drew a folded sheet from his pocket. "I have written to Sir Lionel Graves and Mr. Edward Lansing, inviting them to call here this evening. I trust Miss Fanshawe will also join us. Before the night is done, we shall know which of them has played this dangerous game." He spoke no more, but occupied himself in setting certain small objects upon the table. A candle holder identical to the one from the Grange, a phial of liquid, several wires, and a sheet of clean paper. I could not fathom his intent, though I knew that each preparation was part of the quiet theatre in which he excelled. At 7 o'clock, Miss Clara Fanshawe arrived. She appeared calmer than before, though grief still shadowed her eyes. Holmes greeted her courteously and begged her to seat herself by the fire. "I have made progress," he said gravely. "Your uncle's death, Miss Fanshawe, was no act of his own. He was murdered, and the crime was executed with consummate skill." She gave a low cry. "Murdered? But by whom, Mr. Holmes?" "That, madam, we shall determine shortly. I would ask you only to observe what passes and to remain strong, for the revelation may touch you nearly." She bowed her head in silent assent. Not long after, our visitors were announced together, Sir Lionel Graves and Mr. Edward Lansing. The contrast between them was striking, the one florid and restless, the other pale and composed. Holmes greeted them with the easy courtesy of a host rather than an investigator. "Gentlemen," said he, "I have requested your presence that we may clear from this unhappy affair certain doubts which the law has not dispelled. I ask only for patience and candour. Inspector Foley's report leaves the manner of Colonel Fanshawe's death unexplained. I hope, by demonstration, to fill that gap." Sir Lionel sank into a chair with an air of injured innocence. "My dear Holmes, if it will relieve Miss Fanshawe's mind, by all means proceed. But I assure you, I have nothing to conceal." "And I," said Lansing quietly, "am at your service." Holmes inclined his head. "Excellent. Then we may begin." He took up the candlestick and set it upon the table. "This, gentlemen, is an exact counterpart of that found beside the Colonel's chair. You will recall that traces of prussic acid were detected, yet no vessel or glass was discovered. The explanation lies here." He held the candlestick aloft so that the lamplight glinted upon the brass. A hollow pin runs from the socket downward. When filled with the poison and capped with wax, it releases the vapor gradually as the candle burns, filling the room with a deadly fume. It is, if I may say so, a murder weapon worthy of the utmost ingenuity. Sir Lionel uttered an exclamation of disgust. "Good heavens, man! You don't mean that!" Holmes's voice cut sharply across his protest. "I mean that Colonel Fanshawe's death was achieved precisely in this manner, and I further mean to show which of you had both the wit and the will to employ such a device." He turned suddenly to Lansing. "Mr. Lansing, you were in charge of the Colonel's arrangements that evening? You placed the candle, perhaps?" Lansing met his gaze steadily. "Yes. The Colonel told me to light it when he was ready to begin his vigil. I did so in his presence." "Indeed. Then you will recall whether the candle was new or already half burned?" "It was new, sir." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "A curious thing, for when we found it, it was not the first candle of its kind to be used. The socket bore traces of wax from an earlier candle. Someone had replaced it before the Colonel entered that room." Sir Lionel stirred uneasily, while Miss Fanshawe clasped her hands tightly together. "You accuse me of this trickery?" cried Lansing. "I accuse no one, yet," said Holmes calmly. "But consider, Who among you had knowledge of chemistry sufficient to devise such an instrument? Sir Lionel, for all his debts, is no scholar. Mr. Lansing, however, was once a student of natural philosophy at Cambridge. Lansing started. You have inquired into my past, then? It is my trade to know the truth, Holmes replied. Furthermore, you alone remained with Sir Lionel after the wager was made. You had opportunity to visit the Grange and prepare the room, and you were among the first to discover the body, too soon, perhaps, for comfort. Lansing's composure broke for the first time. "This is monstrous," he cried. "You twist every circumstance to condemn me. Do you suppose I would poison the uncle of the woman I love?" Holmes's gaze was pitiless. "Love, Mr. Lansing, is a fine thing, but inheritance is finer. The Colonel's estate passes to his niece, and through her, to her husband-to-be." Miss Fanshawe rose, pale as the flame that flickered beside her. "Edward, can this be true?" He looked at her with desperation. "Clara, as God lives, I am innocent." "Then prove it," said Holmes, "for the proof is within your reach." He turned to the table once more and picked up the silver half-crown. This coin, found beneath the chair, was polished by recent handling. Its presence was meant to divert suspicion, to suggest theft. But it served another purpose. It was a signal to the man who laid the trap that his work was done. He held it towards Sir Lionel. "You, sir, are the only one who could have understood that signal." Sir Lionel sprang to his feet. "You dare! Are you saying I say," thundered Holmes, "that both of you are guilty, but not in the same degree. The design was Lansing's. The opportunity and motive were yours. Between you, you contrived the Colonel's death, one for debt, the other for greed. The coin was your secret token, a wager won at the cost of a life." For a long moment there was silence. Then Sir Lionel's face crumpled, and he sank into his chair with a groan. "It's true," he muttered. "He planned it. I only consented. I was desperate, ruined, but he swore no harm would come. I thought it a jest, a mere fright." Lansing turned upon him like a man possessed. "Liar! You urged me on. You said it was the only way to save us both." Holmes raised a hand. "Enough. The truth is spoken. The wager was not for money alone. It was, as I have said, a wager for life." The sound of approaching boots in the passage announced the arrival of Inspector Lestrade, whom Holmes had, I now saw, summoned earlier by telegram. The two men were taken into custody. Miss Fanshawe, trembling, rose. "Mr. Holmes, I cannot thank you. My heart is broken, but at least I know the truth." Holmes bowed gravely. "Better the pain of truth, Miss Fanshawe, than the comfort of illusion. Your uncle's honor is restored. That must be your solace." When she had gone, Holmes stood long before the dying fire. "Watson," said he softly, "human folly is the same in every age, greed, vanity, and fear. Yet what is strangest of all is how men wager with death, thinking it a game. Our task is but to reckon the odds." And as the last ember flickered into darkness, I reflected that once again the keen mind of Sherlock Holmes had turned a labyrinth of deceit into the clear daylight of justice. The affair of the Fanshawe wager had ended, as so many of Holmes's investigations did, in swift exposure and unflinching justice. Yet the days that followed were far from tranquil. For my friend, once a case had been resolved, often fell into those stretches of restlessness when his mind, denied the spur of mystery, turned inward upon itself. The newspapers had praised his acumen with their usual hyperbole, and Scotland Yard, through the medium of Inspector Lestrade, had conveyed a formal acknowledgement of his assistance. But Holmes regarded all this with characteristic indifference. "I would rather," said he one morning as he tossed aside the Times, "be confronted with one insoluble trifle than receive the thanks of every policeman in London. The intellect, Watson, is like a blade. It must be kept keen by use, not dulled by applause." He turned from the window and glanced at me with a faint smile. "You look as though you suspect I am growing sentimental. Never fear. The world is large enough for both crime and curiosity." I was about to reply when there came a sharp rap upon the door. Mrs. Hudson ushered in a thin, elderly man with anxious eyes and a curiously precise manner. He bowed stiffly. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I am Mr. Geoffrey Tolliver of the firm of Tolliver and Bright Solicitors. I fear I intrude, but my business touches upon a matter with which your name has been connected." Holmes motioned him to a chair. "Pray proceed, Mr. Tolliver. I have been idle too long." The solicitor produced a sheaf of papers. "You recall, perhaps, the late Colonel Fanshawe?" Holmes inclined his head. "I do not forget my clients." "Then you may be interested to learn," continued the lawyer, "that his will, now before probate, contains a most extraordinary clause, one which might, if taken literally, alter the disposition of his estate. It directs that a sealed packet, lodged in my keeping, should be delivered only to the person responsible for his death. I am bound, by both conscience and curiosity, to ascertain whether this instruction holds any legal weight." Holmes's eyes kindled. "A sealed packet for his murderer? Remarkable. You mean the Colonel foresaw his fate?" Tolliver hesitated. "It seems so. The document is dated 3 months before his death. At that time he was in perfect health and spirits, yet he wrote as though anticipating a violent end." "Have you opened this packet?" "Certainly not. It is sealed with the Colonel's signet. The law forbids me to tamper with it unless certain conditions are met. I confess, Mr. Holmes, the whole affair has an eerie aspect, and I thought it wise to consult you before proceeding." Holmes leaned forward, his long fingers steepled. "You did wisely. Where is this packet now?" "In my office in Chancery Lane. I brought a note of its description." He handed a paper to Holmes, who scanned it quickly. A small envelope addressed in his hand, bearing only the words, "To the one who ends my life." Curious phrasing indeed. Holmes rose abruptly. "Watson, our quiet morning is over. Mr. Tolliver, we shall accompany you to your office." The solicitor appeared startled. "You intend to open it?" "Not yet, but I should like to inspect it. The Colonel's foresight suggests that he feared a particular person, or perhaps possessed evidence concerning his own destruction. If so, this packet may hold the final key to his motives and the tangled web that led to his death." Within the hour, we were seated in Mr. Tolliver's austere office amid rows of ledgers and legal volumes. The sealed envelope lay upon the table, yellowed and unassuming. Holmes examined it with his magnifying lens, turning it beneath the light. "The seal is intact," he murmured. "No sign of tampering. The wax bears the Fanshawe crest. Watson, note the indentation of the pen. The pressure is heavy, as of a man writing with resolution. This was no idle whim." He handed it back to Tolliver. You say you cannot legally open it? Not unless ordered by a magistrate or claimed by the person to whom it is addressed. Holmes smiled slightly. Then, in effect, it can never be opened, since its addressee is a criminal now awaiting trial. Just so, said the solicitor with a sigh. It is a paradox which perplexes both law and logic. Holmes's eyes glimmered. Perhaps not for long. Might I request to be present should the authorities permit it to be examined? There may be something yet to learn. Tolliver agreed readily, and after his departure, Holmes stood long at the window, lost in thought. "Watson," said he at length, "I begin to wonder whether our case is quite finished. Suppose the Colonel's death was but one act of a larger play. What if he himself had laid some snare, foreseeing treachery? You think he may have written the packet as a trap? Possibly. The Colonel was a soldier, a strategist. He may have known more of his enemies than we imagined. Remember the half-crown? A token, perhaps, but of what? Suppose it were part of the code, one that points beyond the grave." That evening, Holmes immersed himself in old newspapers, club records, and letters borrowed from Miss Fanshawe. I sat opposite, making notes as he dictated fragments of his deductions. "See here, Watson," he said at last. "Colonel Fanshawe served in India under the late Sir Reginald Graves, father to our unfortunate Sir Lionel. The elder Graves was dismissed the service under scandal, while the Colonel testified against him. It is not difficult to trace a current of enmity running in that family's blood. Sir Lionel's debts and ruin may have been only the visible symptoms of a deeper vendetta." I looked up. Then the Colonel's foresight was the foresight of a man who expected revenge. He may have written that packet as a final move, ensuring that his killer, in claiming the inheritance, would be exposed. What if the letter contains a confession, not by the murderer, but by the victim himself, designed to spring after his death? Holmes paced the floor, excitement in every line of his figure. "There is more here, Watson. I can feel it, like a chord half struck. We have grasped the branch, but not yet the root." 2 days later, a telegram arrived from Mr. Tolliver. "Packet opened by authority. Stop contents startling. Stop request. Your immediate attendance. Stop." Within the hour, we were at Chancery Lane again. The solicitor met us pale and agitated, a torn envelope on the desk before him. "You were right, Mr. Holmes. The Colonel's foresight was uncanny. The letter inside is addressed to you." "To me?" Holmes exclaimed, genuinely startled. He broke the second seal and read in silence, his eyes narrowing as he absorbed each line. When he finished, he laid the sheet upon the table. "Watson," said he slowly, "this is no mere letter. It is a summons from beyond the grave." I bent over the page. In the Colonel's bold hand were written the words, "If you are reading this, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, then my death has come as I foresaw. I do not know the manner, but I am certain of the cause. There are forces moving against me, old wrongs, hidden debts, and secrets long buried in India. Seek the truth, not in my death alone, but in the life I once took. The past does not sleep. Ask at the house called Blackthorn Lodge." Holmes folded the letter carefully. His voice was very low. "Watson," said he, "our case is not ended. It has only just begun. The shadow that fell upon Colonel Fanshawe stretches far wider than Kent or London. It reaches back to the Empire itself. We are about to follow it." And as the fog deepened beyond the window panes, I saw again the familiar gleam in my companion's eyes, the gleam of the hunter who has scented prey. It was a cold, clear morning when we set forth for Surrey, where, according to the Colonel's letter, there stood a place known as Blackthorn Lodge. The name itself had an ominous ring to it, and when Holmes inquired at the station master at Whitley, the man's brow furrowed. "Aye, sir," said he. "Blackthorn Lodge lies about 3 miles from here, beyond the heath. A lonely place, that. It's been shut these 6 years or more, since the owner died abroad. But if you're going there, I'd advise you take care. The villagers give it a wide berth after dark." Holmes smiled faintly. "Thank you, my good fellow. I believe it is precisely the kind of place where truth prefers to hide." We hired a trap and drove through the rolling countryside. The heather lay purple upon the slopes, and the wind whispered through the pines. Yet, as we approached the lodge, a strange stillness seemed to fall about us. It stood upon a rise, grim and shuttered, its tall chimneys pointing like black fingers into the morning sky. Holmes regarded it intently as we dismounted. "A house of secrets, Watson," he murmured. "If these walls could speak, they might tell us why a man wrote from his grave to summon us here." The gate was locked, but my companion, with his usual disregard for obstacles, produced a small tool from his pocket and had it open in moments. We advanced up the weed-choked drive, our steps muffled by the soft earth. Inside, the air was heavy with disuse. Dust hung like fog in the beams of our lanterns, and cobwebs veiled the corners. We found the hall intact, faded carpets, portraits warped by damp, and furniture draped in ghostly sheets. Holmes moved from room to room, his eyes darting over every object. "Observe, Watson," said he, stopping before a tall cabinet. "This house has been closed, yet someone has been here within recent months. Note the absence of dust upon the latch, the faint scuff upon the floor. And look here, wax from a candle, fallen but recently. Someone has visited this tomb." He knelt and examined the wax. A fine, white taper of foreign make, possibly from the same mould as that used at the Grange. I begin to discern a continuity between the two tragedies. Then this house was connected with Colonel Fanshawe. Undoubtedly. He wrote of a life once taken. The reference to India cannot be ignored. It was there that he and Sir Reginald Graves served. I suspect that Blackthorn Lodge conceals a relic of that service, a relic that links the old crime with the new. We explored the lower rooms in silence until Holmes's keen gaze fixed upon a door beneath the staircase. It was narrow and partly concealed by an old tapestry. He drew it open. A steep stair descended into darkness. "Excellent," he exclaimed. "Every mystery deserves its cellar. Come, Watson, our candle shall light the way." We descended cautiously. The air grew colder, and a faint odour of damp and metal met our nostrils. The cellar was small, lined with shelves and empty casks. In one corner stood a large wooden chest bound with iron. Holmes approached it and ran his hand along the lid. Locked, as expected, yet the lock is modern. Let us see whether its maker was as ingenious as its owner. In a few minutes, the lock yielded to his deft manipulation. He raised the lid, and we both started back. For within lay not the expected relics of furniture, but a soldier's uniform, folded with military precision, and beside it, a rusted sabre stained darkly along the edge. Holmes drew a long breath. The sword of the colonel, perhaps, or of the man he killed. A small leather-bound journal lay atop the uniform. He opened it, and the first page bore the inscription, Diary of Captain Arthur W. Haldane, 1879. Good heavens, I cried. Haldane! Was he not the officer who vanished in India under mysterious circumstances? The same, said Holmes quietly. He disappeared during the campaign at Cawnpore. Fanshawe was present, so was Reginald Graves. Here, Watson, we may at last learn what happened there. He turned the pages, reading swiftly. The entries were written in a firm hand at first, growing tremulous toward the end. They spoke of hardship, mutiny, and suspicion among the ranks. One passage caught Holmes's eye. June 14th. Rumours persist that Colonel Fanshawe intends to accuse me of treachery. He suspects I have dealings with the natives. I swear I am innocent. Graves alone knows the truth, but he hates me too. If anything befalls me, let this book bear witness. Another, written weeks later, chilled us both. July the 3rd. There was a quarrel tonight. Fanshawe struck me. I fear for my life. If I am found dead, remember this. I never betrayed my country. The guilt lies with another. The final page was smeared with water stains and ended abruptly. Holmes closed the book gently. There, Watson, lies the root of it all. Fanshawe, Graves, Haldane. 3 men bound by the shadow of a killing, long concealed. Fanshawe must have slain Haldane in that quarrel and buried the matter. His conscience, or his fear of vengeance, drove him to write the letter that brought us here. Sir Lionel's crime was but the echo of that older sin. He straightened, eyes shining. We must verify this with records from the War Office. If we can prove that Haldane was reported missing under false pretenses, the entire edifice of deceit will collapse. At that instant, a faint sound reached us, a creak upon the stair above. Holmes's hand went to his pocket, and I felt my pulse quicken. "Someone follows us," he whispered. "Extinguish the lantern." We waited in darkness, breath held, as the steps descended softly. A figure appeared at the bottom of the stairs, holding a candle, the pale oval of a face gleaming faintly. Holmes sprang forward like a tiger. The candle fell, sputtering. There was a brief struggle, and then he dragged the intruder into the light. It was Miss Clara Fanshawe. She looked from one to the other of us with wild eyes. "Forgive me," she gasped. "I had to come. I received a letter, anonymous, telling me you would find proof of my uncle's guilt here. I could not rest until I knew." Holmes regarded her gravely. "You are fortunate that it was we who found you, and not another. But tell me, who sent this letter?" "I do not know. It was unsigned, posted in London. It said only, 'The truth lies beneath Blackthorn Lodge.'" Holmes exchanged a quick glance with me. "So, Watson, the plot thickens once more. Someone wishes this secret to be revealed. But for what purpose? To exonerate the Colonel, or to lure us to our deaths?" He took Miss Fanshawe's arm gently. "You must leave this place at once. We shall guard what we have found and return to London tonight." She hesitated, staring at the chest. Was my uncle truly a murderer? Holmes's voice softened. "We know only that he carried a burden of remorse. Whether that remorse was for guilt or injustice, time will tell. But take heart, Miss Fanshawe. The living truth is always kinder than the ghost of doubt." As we emerged from the house, the wind rose, sighing through the blackthorn hedge like the breath of the past. I glanced back at the silent windows of the lodge. and it seemed to me that the ghosts of India watched us depart. Holmes spoke only once during the long drive to the station. "Watson, the dead have begun to speak, and before they fall silent again, we must be ready to listen." Our return to London was conducted in silence. Holmes sat opposite me in the dimly lit carriage, his features cast in relief against the glass as the countryside sped past. I could see that the find at Blackthorn Lodge had stirred him profoundly, though he concealed his thoughts behind that mask of composure which even I, after years of acquaintance, could seldom penetrate. The diary of Captain Haldane lay upon his knee, its worn leather cover marked with his thumb. He had scarcely spoken since we left Surrey. When we arrived at Baker Street, it was close upon midnight. Holmes threw himself into his chair, lit his pipe, and opened the journal once more, reading line by line with an intensity that would have daunted a scholar poring over a papyrus of the pharaohs. The faint rasp of the page turning was the only sound in the room. At length he said, "Watson, the truth of this affair lies not in the present, but in the far shadows of the past. These pages are more than a confession. They are a map written by a dying hand. We must read it not as words, but as strategy." He pointed to a passage. "Here, Haldane mentions that he kept certain dispatches which he feared might be used against him. Dispatches sealed with his name and hidden in what he calls the place of the black thorn. That phrase recurs again and again. I had thought it metaphor, but now, having seen that lodge, perhaps it is literal. The question is, what became of those papers? They may have been found by Colonel Fanshawe, I suggested. Perhaps. Or he may have buried them where no hand could reach. In either case, the secret of those dispatches must have haunted him all his life. Their recovery would explain the letter we received, and the mysterious warning sent to Miss Fanshawe." He leaned back, exhaling a thin wisp of smoke. "We must tread carefully. There are forces here that move unseen. Someone else knew of Blackthorn Lodge, someone who feared or hoped that we would uncover this trail. We must find who sent that letter and why." The following morning, Holmes was abroad early. When he returned, shortly after 10, he carried a small packet of documents and a look of subdued triumph. "I have been to the War Office," said he, tossing his gloves aside. "The records confirm that Captain Haldane was indeed accused of treachery on evidence submitted by Colonel Fanshawe and Major Reginald Graves. He was declared missing after an encounter with native insurgents and presumed dead. No body was ever recovered. His property confiscated. And the accusation? Fabricated, almost certainly. There was never proof. Fanshawe's own report is ambiguous. It condemns Haldane by implication rather than fact. It was an expedient move, Watson, made during a time when failure meant ruin. The Colonel's reputation was saved and Haldane's destroyed. But conscience has a long memory. Holmes paced the floor, his thin fingers clasped behind his back. What I find remarkable is that the Graves family appears throughout. Reginald Graves fell in disgrace, his son Lionel in debt, and both connected to Fanshawe by ties of secrecy. The web is tightening, my dear fellow. He paused suddenly, as though struck by a thought. We must return to the lodge. Today, I believe there is one more thing hidden there, something we overlooked. I groaned inwardly, for the journey was long and the December air biting, but I knew better than to protest. By noon, we were again upon the Surrey road, the sky low and leaden with the threat of snow. When we reached Blackthorn Lodge, Holmes lost no time. He strode through the empty rooms with quick, impatient steps, his gaze darting from floor to wall, as if expecting the house itself to speak. At length, he halted before the fireplace in the study. "Watson, do you observe the soot pattern on the bricks? It is uneven, as though the fire burned hotter on one side. I fancy that behind this hearth there is something concealed." He took up the poker and tapped along the masonry. A hollow sound answered. Within moments he had dislodged a panel, revealing a narrow cavity. From it, he drew a small tin box wrapped in oilskin. Holmes's eyes shone with triumph. "The dispatches. They have slept here all these years." He opened the box carefully. Within lay several folded papers, their ink faded but legible. One bore the signature of Colonel Fanshawe, another the seal of the British garrison at Cawnpore. Holmes spread them out upon the mantel and read swiftly. "The evidence is conclusive," he said at last. "Captain Haldane was innocent. These dispatches were forged by Reginald Graves to conceal his own mismanagement. Fanshawe, perhaps under pressure, attested them. Haldane discovered the fraud, confronted him, and in the ensuing quarrel was killed. The affair was hushed up as an accident, and the two surviving officers swore secrecy. That is the skeleton upon which this entire tragedy was built." I stared at him. "And the letter to you, why was it written?" "Because Fanshawe, in his later years, foresaw that his sins would be visited upon him. The past returned in the person of Graves's son, Lionel, whose ruin revived the old hatred. The colonel knew that vengeance was near. His letter to me was not prophecy, it was insurance. He wished his death to unmask the crime of long ago. He gathered the papers and sealed them once more. We shall place these in the proper hands. The name of Haldane will be cleared at last." At that moment, the faint crunch of wheels upon gravel reached our ears. Holmes stiffened, extinguished his lantern, and motioned me to silence. Through the curtain of the dusty window, I saw a closed carriage drawing up before the house. A man alighted, muffled in a dark coat and hat pulled low. "Stay here," Holmes whispered. "Let us see who our ghostly visitor may be." The door creaked open, and the man entered cautiously, striking a match to light his way. Holmes waited until he stepped fully into the room, then seized his arm. The stranger gave a cry, but Holmes's voice cut through it. "You are expected, Mr. Henry Graves." The man tore free with an oath. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" "I might ask the same. You come to reclaim what your family buried with lies. We have already uncovered it." Graves, Sir Lionel's younger brother, as I now recognized, stared wildly at the tin box. "You found them? Then it's true. My father's name, my brother's disgrace. They were all built on this foul deception." His face was pale with emotion. "I meant only to destroy them, to end the shame. I sent the letter to Miss Fanshawe. I hoped you would uncover the truth, but not this way. I never dreamed blood would follow blood." Holmes regarded him keenly. "You are fortunate, Mr. Graves, that we came before you. The law will decide the matter of these papers, but your intentions appear, if not noble, at least comprehensible." Graves sank into a chair, covering his face. "May God forgive them all," he murmured. Holmes touched my arm. "Come, Watson. The ghosts of Blackthorn Lodge have spoken their last. It remains for us to carry their message to the living. As we left the house, the first flakes of snow began to fall, drifting white across the heath. Holmes stood for a moment, watching them with that rare gentleness which sometimes softened his keen expression. "The Colonel sought to redeem himself in death," he said quietly. "Perhaps he has done so. There are crimes, Watson, that time alone can judge, and it is a harsher magistrate than any court of man." We turned away, leaving behind the shuttered windows and the secrets they had held so long, while the snow erased our footprints as though even the earth wished to forget. Several days had passed since our return from Surrey, and the events surrounding Blackthorn Lodge had stirred no small amount of comment in the press. The authorities had confirmed the authenticity of the recovered dispatches, and Captain Arthur Haldane's honour had been formally restored. Yet, as Holmes observed to me one evening while we sat by the fire, justice, my dear Watson, is seldom as tidy as the newspapers would have it. We may have exposed a historical wrong, but there remains a moral riddle still unsolved. He leaned back in his chair, the blue smoke from his pipe curling above his head like mist over a moor. Fanshawe died, haunted by remorse. The younger Graves destroyed himself through avarice, and yet it was their victims who have slept most peacefully. I cannot decide, Watson, whether retribution is the design of Providence or merely the accident of guilt. I smiled at his philosophic tone. "You are growing reflective, Holmes. It is a sign that your mind is craving a new puzzle." "You are correct," he said, with a faint laugh. "I feel like a violin long left unstrung. Fortunately, fate seldom leaves me idle for long." At that very instant, there came a knock at the door, sharp and urgent. Mrs. Hudson ushered in a uniformed messenger who handed Holmes a telegram. He tore it open, read swiftly, and sprang to his feet. "Ah, here is our next note in the symphony, Watson. It is from Inspector Lestrade. He requests my immediate attendance at Scotland Yard upon a matter that touches closely the late Colonel Fanshawe case. Bring your coat. We are wanted." Within half an hour, we were seated opposite Lestrade in his office at the Yard. The inspector's usually impassive face bore a look of perplexity. "You'll remember, Mr. Holmes," said he, "the secretary in the Fanshawe affair, the fellow Lansing. He's escaped from custody." "Escaped?" Holmes repeated. "Vanished, more like. 2 nights ago, he was being moved from the local jail to London for trial. The escorting officer was found unconscious at the roadside. The prisoner had disappeared, leaving no trace save the broken chain on his wrist." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "This was done with assistance, of course." "Undoubtedly. We've reason to believe he had confederates in town. But that's not all. This morning, a watchman at Chancery Lane swore he saw a man answering Lansing's description near the offices of Tolliver and Bright, the very place where that letter of the Colonel's was kept." Holmes steepled his fingers. "Intriguing. The past still pursues its own resurrection. What of the packet? Was anything disturbed?" "Not a thing. The clerk heard footsteps but found nothing missing." Holmes rose. "Then Lansing's purpose was not theft, but knowledge. He suspects what we have uncovered and means to learn how much we know. I think, Lestrade, the game is not yet played out." We left the Yard as dusk fell over Westminster, the lamps winking to life one by one. Holmes strode rapidly along the embankment, his face alight with renewed energy. "Watson, mark my words. Lansing is not running from justice. He is hunting something. Perhaps he believes that the truth can yet be twisted to his advantage. If he reaches Miss Fanshawe, he may attempt persuasion or vengeance. We must warn her. We arrived at her lodgings in Bloomsbury as the church bells struck 6. Miss Clara Fanshawe received us with visible anxiety. "I feared something was amiss," she said. "This morning I found this note slipped under my door." She handed Holmes a crumpled piece of paper. He unfolded it carefully. The writing was unmistakably Lansing's, neat, precise, but tremulous with emotion. "Clara, do not believe all they have told you. I was driven to it by forces you do not understand. Meet me tonight at 8 by the fountain in St. James's Park. I swear to you, I am innocent." Holmes read the message twice, then passed it to me. "So," said he softly, "the fox calls to the dove. This meeting, Watson, may prove most instructive." Miss Fanshawe's eyes filled with distress. "You think it a trap?" "Perhaps, and perhaps not. But it is an opportunity we cannot ignore. You will permit us to act in your stead?" She hesitated only a moment. "Yes, do what you must. Only promise me he shall not be harmed unless he gives you cause." Holmes bowed gravely. "You have my word." That night we took up our position near the fountain, concealed in the shadow of the trees. The park was nearly deserted, save for the occasional constable making his round. A thin mist drifted over the water, and the lamps glimmered faintly through it. At 8:15, a figure approached the fountain from the direction of Birdcage Walk. He was muffled in a long coat, his hat drawn low. He glanced about him nervously, and then seated himself upon the stone ledge, waiting. Holmes motioned for silence. Presently, another figure appeared, a woman's silhouette moving swiftly along the path. I started, for it was unmistakably Miss Fanshawe. "Good heavens," I whispered. "She has come herself." Holmes muttered an oath under his breath. "Foolish, brave creature. Stay close, Watson." She reached the fountain and halted a few paces from Lansing. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she said, her voice low but firm, "Edward, why have you done this?" He turned toward her, anguish in his tone. "Clara, they have lied to you. I was no murderer. It was Graves. He planned it all. I was his pawn, nothing more. He promised me fortune and freedom, and when the thing was done, he turned on me. I swear I meant your uncle no harm." "You poisoned him," she cried. "No, I placed the candle at his bidding, believing it a harmless jest to frighten him. He had filled it with the poison himself. It was revenge for his father's disgrace." I felt Holmes's hand tighten upon my arm. "Now, Watson, we shall see whether the truth is born of fear or falsehood." But before we could step forward, a sudden flash split the darkness. A shot rang out. Lansing staggered, clutched his breast, and fell backward into the fountain with a splash that sent ripples spreading across the water. Miss Fanshawe screamed. Holmes dashed forward, scanning the shadows. "There!" he cried. I glimpsed a fleeing figure at the far end of the path, a man in a dark overcoat running toward the mall. We gave chase, but the mist swallowed him. A cab rattled away into the fog, and the sound of its wheels faded into silence. When we returned, Lestrade and 2 constables had arrived, summoned by the commotion. Lansing still lived, though faintly. Holmes knelt beside him. "Who fired the shot?" he asked. The dying man's lips moved. "Graves, the younger." His hand groped weakly toward Miss Fanshawe. "Tell her, I loved her, and I never meant—" His voice broke, and he was still. Holmes rose slowly. "So, The curtain falls on another act of vengeance. Henry Graves sought to bury his family's shame and has written its epitaph instead. Come, Watson. We have one more pursuit before this night is done. And as we followed the trail into the fog, I felt the chill of the wind pierce deeper than the cold itself. For we were walking once again in the shadow where guilt and retribution meet. The events of that dreadful night in St. James's Park left me shaken for days afterward. I had seen death many times before, yet there was something peculiarly pitiful in the end of Edward Lansing, the man who, whatever his guilt, had been caught like a moth between two flames of vengeance, not of his own kindling. For Holmes, however, there was no place for sentiment until every shadow of the mystery had been dispelled. We returned to Baker Street long after midnight, cold, wet, and silent, save for the rumble of wheels over the slick cobbles. Once within our rooms, Holmes threw off his coat and paced before the hearth with his usual restless stride. His grey eyes gleamed with that bright inward fire which I had come to associate with the final movements of a case. "Watson," he said at last, "the shot that killed Lansing was fired from a Webley revolver at a range of 20 yards. It was a single, deliberate act, not the haphazard impulse of panic. Henry Graves meant to kill him, not to escape him. You think Graves was lying in wait? Undoubtedly. He must have followed Lansing to the park, perhaps from the moment the letter was sent. Lansing believed himself still the master of events. Graves had already written his conclusion." He stopped abruptly. And yet, what now? What purpose drove him to silence Lansing when his own confession at Blackthorn Lodge had already compromised him? Why not flee abroad with the remains of his family fortune? No, my dear fellow, something else binds him to this ruin. There is still a missing piece, and until we find it, we cannot rest. He reached for his violin, played a few low vibrating notes, and then, as though the sound itself had sharpened his mind, sprang to the desk and began sorting the papers from the Fanshawe and Haldane investigations. "Observe," he said. "Here is a letter from the War Office concerning Captain Haldane's dispatches. And here, Tolliver's memorandum regarding the Colonel's will. Both documents mention a fourth name, barely noticed before. One Major Conrad Brent, adjutant at Cawnpore. He was present at the Court of Inquiry, but disappeared soon after, resigning his commission. I made some inquiries this morning. It appears he now lives under the name of Brentwood in Ealing. He may provide the last link in this chain of blood." I confess that my interest quickened at once. "Then we shall see him at once." Holmes nodded curtly. "After breakfast, a good night's rest will serve you better than a sleepless chase through London fog." The following morning was crisp and clear, the air holding the first bite of frost. By 10 o'clock we were in Ealing, standing before a modest but well-kept villa behind a wrought-iron gate. A servant showed us into a study lined with books and military trophies. At the desk sat a man of about 60, tall, spare, his complexion bronzed by years in the tropics. He rose slowly as we entered, and I noted the faint limp of an old campaigner. "Major Brent," said Holmes. "I am Sherlock Holmes, and this is my friend Dr. Watson. We come upon a matter connected with the late Colonel Fanshawe and Captain Arthur Haldane." The man's face paled slightly. "Those names belong to another lifetime, Mr. Holmes. Why trouble me with them now?" "Because that lifetime is not as dead as you imagine. Holmes replied. The crimes committed at Cornpore have borne their fruit in London. Brent's eyes flickered toward a small photograph on the mantelpiece, a group of officers in tropical dress. You know then? He said quietly. I know enough to suspect that you hold the remainder of the truth. The Major sank into his chair, covering his eyes with one hand. I had hoped the secret would die with them, he murmured. But perhaps it is better this way. The stain has followed me too long. He drew a deep breath. Yes, I was there the night Haldane died. We were encamped near the river. There had been rumors, talk of spies among our ranks. Haldane was reckless in his dealings with the natives. He paid them fairly, treated them kindly. Some officers called it weakness. Graves accused him openly of treachery. Fanshawe tried to mediate, but tempers were high. I saw them quarrel. I heard the shot. When I reached them, Haldane was dead, and Fanshawe stood over him with a smoking pistol. He swore it was self-defense. The inquiry cleared him, but the truth was never told. And Graves Sr.? Holmes asked. He wrote the false report. He feared scandal. He needed a scapegoat to hide his own blunders. Fanshawe's silence was the price of his future. That silence has poisoned 3 generations. Holmes's expression hardened. And the younger Graves knew this? Brent nodded. His father confessed it on his deathbed. Henry Graves came to me last year asking for proof. I refused him. I was weary of ghosts. Perhaps I was wrong. Holmes turned to me. There lies our motive entire. Graves killed Lansing not to hide his own guilt, but to obliterate the last witness who could dispute his family's redemption. He wished to play the martyr, the avenger of Haldane's honor, so he silenced the one man who could reveal his complicity. Brent rose suddenly. Then justice has come at last. I have lived with this burden 30 years. What will you do, Mr. Holmes? What I always do, Holmes answered quietly. Bring truth into daylight. It is the only disinfectant strong enough for such corruption. We took our leave, and as we walked toward the station, Holmes was uncharacteristically grave. You see, Watson, how every deceit breeds another. Each lie demands a second to cover it, until the chain is long enough to hang all who forged it. Graves will not escape us long. He was right. That evening brought a message from Lestrade. Henry Graves had been traced to a lodging house near King's Cross. We drove there at once. The constables had already surrounded the place. Inside, the landlady, pale with fright, pointed to the upper floor. He's been shut in all day, sir. Refused food. Said he was ill. Holmes ascended quietly, revolver in hand. At the top, he paused, listening. A faint scratching reached our ears, a pen moving over paper. He pushed open the door. Henry Graves sat at the desk, writing by the light of a single candle. He looked up, calm but ghastly pale. You are punctual, Mr. Holmes. I expected you sooner. Your flight is over, Mr. Graves, said Holmes. Lansing's blood and your father's sins alike cry for reckoning. Graves smiled faintly. You need not trouble the courts. I have written my confession. The family curse ends with me. Before we could stop him, he snatched a small bottle from his pocket and drank. Holmes sprang forward, but too late. Graves fell back with a sigh, the paper fluttering from his fingers. I bent over him. He is dead, I said. Holmes stooped to retrieve the paper. And with him dies the last echo of Cornpore. We read the confession in silence. It was brief, an acknowledgement of the deception wrought by his forebears, of the blackmail that bound Lansing, and of his own act of vengeance in the park. It ended with a single line. Let the name of Graves be forgotten, and that of Haldane remembered. Holmes folded the sheet and placed it in his pocket. There is justice enough in that, I think. No need for further pursuit. As we left the dim lodging, dawn was breaking over the city. The first light touched the wet pavements, turning them to silver. Holmes paused upon the step, drawing his coat about him. "Watson," said he, "it is a strange thing, this pursuit of truth. We chase it as men chase a mirage, only to find, when we reach it, that the reflection is ourselves. The world will call this case closed, but I fancy there are no victors here, only survivors." And with that, he turned toward the waking streets, his lean figure swallowed by the London mist. In the days that followed Henry Graves's death, London resumed its indifferent pulse, as though the tragic history that had wound through 3 generations had never existed. The newspapers devoted a column to it. Strange End of a Gentleman, the Fanshawe mystery concluded. And within a week, even that column was displaced by the gossip of Parliament and the progress of the influenza epidemic. But to Sherlock Holmes, the affair was not a mere curiosity to be laid aside with the morning's paper. "I tell you, Watson," he said one evening as we sat before the fire, "the world's memory is a sieve, but mine is a ledger. I cannot strike out the name of any man whose fall began in falsehood. The Graves and Fanshawe families are but an epitome of society. How pride breeds deceit, and deceit breeds tragedy. Were I a moralist, I might write a sermon upon the theme." I could not help but smile. "You have written sermons enough already. Only your pulpit happens to be the witness box." He chuckled softly and rose to fill his pipe. "Perhaps so. And yet, I confess, there lingers about this affair a faint discord, as though one note in the symphony has been played out of tune." I looked up from my newspaper. "You mean there is still some doubt?" Holmes stood at the window, staring out into the murky street. "Not doubt, rather incompletion. There are questions unanswered. Who warned Miss Fanshawe to come to Blackthorn Lodge? Why did Lansing receive the poison from Graves without understanding its use? And how did the Colonel foresee so precisely that his death would arise from his own past? You think there was a hand beyond even Graves's? I do not yet know, but I have learned never to assume that the grave closes the case. Sometimes it merely conceals the next chapter." He turned abruptly from the window. "Watson, have you any inclination for a short journey? There is a certain item still lying in the archives of the War Office that I would see for myself." And so it was that the next morning found us bound for Whitehall. The fog was thick, clinging to the gas lamps like smoke, and the river lay hidden under a grey shroud. Within the solemn corridors of the War Office, Holmes's name carried a quiet authority. We were soon admitted to the dusty room where records of the Indian campaigns were stored. A clerk brought out a dispatch box stamped Cawnpore, 1879. Holmes donned a pair of gloves and began to sift through the brittle papers with a surgeon's care. "Here, Watson, this is what I expected. The personal correspondence of Colonel Fanshawe." Among the official documents lay several private letters. Most were trivial: reports of supplies, complaints of heat, notes on troop morale. But one, written in a firm, unfamiliar hand, arrested Holmes's attention. He read it once, then again, his face growing intent. "Listen to this, Watson. It is from one E.L., the initials of Edward Lansing. My dear Colonel, if you persist in pressing these charges, you will destroy more than your enemy. There are orders you yourself signed that would not bear scrutiny. Remember your promise to me in Delhi, and keep faith with those who have kept silence for you." Holmes laid the letter down thoughtfully. So, Lansing's connection with the Colonel predates the wager by many years. He was in India at the time, perhaps as a junior aide or clerk. The bond between them was not of friendship, but of complicity. Lansing knew something which, had it been revealed, would have ruined Fanshawe. Then, his later involvement was no accident. Precisely. The web stretches farther than even I thought. Lansing was drawn back into the Colonel's life because he was the only man living who shared his guilt. Graves merely exploited what time and circumstance had already prepared. The true architect of the Colonel's death, therefore, was not vengeance, but destiny, the old sin waiting for its reckoning. We left the War Office in silence. Holmes appeared absorbed in some deep calculation. That evening, however, as we dined at Baker Street, a messenger arrived bearing a letter. It was addressed in a delicate, feminine hand. Holmes broke the seal and read. His expression softened. "From Miss Fanshawe," he said. "She writes that she intends to leave England for a time, to join an aunt in Florence. She thanks us for restoring her uncle's name and for, here is the phrase, teaching me that courage lies not in silence, but in facing truth." He folded the letter and slipped it into his pocket. "A brave woman, Watson. I hope she finds peace among the olive groves. London holds too many ghosts." A week passed uneventfully. Then, one bleak afternoon, I returned from my practice to find Holmes crouched before the fire, his gaze fixed upon the dancing flames. He looked up sharply as I entered. "Watson, do you recall the candle that killed Colonel Fanshawe?" "How could I forget?" He leaned forward. "I have just received word from the Yard. The manufacturer of that candlestick, whose mark was found upon the base, is a small firm in Islington, Blake and Sons. They report that 3 such candlesticks were ordered 2 months before the Colonel's death. The purchaser gave his name as Major Conrad Brent." I started. Brent, but he seemed an honourable man. Indeed, and yet he was the last living witness of Haldane's death. If he supplied the weapon, it may not have been Graves alone who sought vengeance. He rose, his face pale with suppressed excitement. "Watson, we are not done. The ghosts are not yet laid to rest. Fetch your coat. We shall pay another call upon Ealing before the day is out." It was near twilight when we reached the quiet lane where Major Brent's villa stood. A single light burned in the upper window. Holmes knocked sharply, but there was no reply. He tried the latch. It yielded. We entered the hall. All was silent save for the ticking of a distant clock. On the table in the study lay a folded newspaper and an open bottle of port. Beside it, a revolver. Holmes crossed swiftly to the inner room. I heard him utter a short exclamation. I followed and stopped dead. Major Brent sat slumped in his chair, his head bowed upon his chest. A small hole marred his temple. The pistol had fallen from his limp hand. Upon the table lay a note addressed to Mr. Sherlock Holmes. Holmes tore it open. The brief message within was written in a firm but tremulous script. "You were right, Mr. Holmes. There is no peace for those who have buried truth. I armed Graves to strike the blow I lacked the courage to deliver. I sought justice for Haldane, but found only guilt. I end what should have ended long ago. The sins of the fathers are avenged at last. For a long while, Holmes said nothing. At last, he replaced the paper gently upon the desk. "It is over, Watson. The final hand in this accursed drama has written its own sentence." We left the house as the first flakes of snow drifted down. The lamplighter's pole gleamed through the gathering dusk like a wand of fire. "Strange, is it not," I said, "that justice should so often come clothed as tragedy?" Holmes looked upward at the falling snow. "Justice, Watson," he murmured, "is rarely merciful. It arrives when the heart has grown too weary to resist it." And thus ended the long and somber tale that had begun with a foolish wager and concluded in blood and repentance. A tale that, as Holmes said later, proved once more that truth, however long delayed, walks with the sure step of fate. The winter deepened that year, and London lay shrouded in its customary veil of smoke and frost. Yet within the familiar sitting room at Baker Street, the air was heavy, not with fog, but with reflection. Holmes had been silent for many hours, his long figure stretched upon the sofa, his eyes fixed upon the ceiling, as if tracing invisible equations upon its plaster. The fire burned low, casting restless shadows that seemed to mimic the ceaseless movement of his mind. It had been 3 weeks since the death of Major Brent, that last act in the tragedy of the Fanshawe affair. The inquest had returned a verdict of suicide, and the newspapers, weary of the story, had let it die a quiet death. To the public, the case was closed. To Holmes, it was not. At last, he spoke, his voice low and even. "Watson, have you ever considered that the most dangerous weapon a man may wield is not a pistol or a knife, but guilt?" I looked up from my book. "You mean to say, Holmes, that you still believe there is more to be uncovered in this business?" "I believe," said he slowly, "that truth seldom ends where men wish it to. We have seen 3 deaths, each born from the same poisoned seed, the concealment of one crime in India 30 years ago. Yet, I have the uneasy conviction that there is a 4th hand in this affair, one that has escaped our notice entirely." "Surely, the chain is complete," I protested. "Fanshawe, Graves, Lansing, Brent, each played his part, and each has met his fate." Holmes smiled faintly. "You reason with admirable symmetry, my dear fellow, but symmetry is the property of art, not of life. Consider, who sent Miss Fanshawe the anonymous letter which drew her to Blackthorn Lodge? Not Lansing, for he denied it. Not Graves, who later confessed to sending only the 2nd letter. Nor Brent, who never left Ealing. The sender remains unknown, and until we answer that question, the circle is open." He rose and began pacing. "Someone orchestrated the final movement of this drama, a hand unseen but deft. I have spent these 3 weeks searching for that hand." "And you have found it?" "Perhaps," he murmured. "Do you recall, Watson, the name of the solicitor who first brought us the Colonel's posthumous letter?" "Mr. Tolliver of Chancery Lane." "Precisely. A man of precision, with access to the Fanshawe papers, and, more curiously, a family connection to the late Captain Haldane. His mother was Haldane's sister. The relationship was distant, but it existed, and yet he never mentioned it. Does that not strike you as remarkable?" I stared at him. "You think Tolliver was involved?" Holmes smiled without mirth. "Involved, or perhaps avenging. The line between the two is thinner than most imagine. Before I could reply, there came a knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, bearing a card upon a tray. Holmes glanced at it, and a gleam of irony crossed his face. "Speak of the devil," he said. "Mr. Geoffrey Tolliver himself." The solicitor entered, his expression grave but composed. "Mr. Holmes, forgive the intrusion, but I have come upon a matter which may concern you. It appears that Major Brent, before his death, deposited a sealed envelope in my office marked for delivery to you upon his decease." Holmes motioned him to a chair. "Indeed. You might have spared yourself the journey. I had already anticipated the gesture. Let us see this envelope." Tolliver handed it over. It was small, of heavy paper, and sealed with red wax. Holmes broke the seal and drew forth a single sheet. His eyes flicked over it, and for a moment even he seemed startled. He handed it to me without a word. The message was short. To Mr. Sherlock Holmes. "If you would learn who began this chain of vengeance, look not to India, but to London. The first lie was spoken not at Cornpore, but in Chancery Lane. Ask the man who keeps the dead men's secrets." Holmes turned his gaze upon Tolliver, whose colour had faded to the hue of parchment. "An interesting communication," said Holmes softly. "Would you care to explain it?" The solicitor's lips moved soundlessly for a moment. "Good God, Holmes, you cannot mean—" "But I do mean it," Holmes interrupted. "You, Mr. Tolliver, were the one who first stirred these embers to life. It was you who sent the anonymous letter to Miss Fanshawe, you who summoned us into the affair, and you who ensured that each man met his fate. You have used justice as a mask for revenge." Tolliver sank back into his chair, his composure collapsing. "You are devilishly right," he whispered. "For 30 years, I have carried my uncle's disgrace like a chain around my neck. When I learned the truth of his innocence, I swore that those who destroyed him should suffer as he did. Fanshawe, Graves, Brent, they were all guilty. I set the stage. I merely gave them the rope with which they hanged themselves." Holmes regarded him with a strange mixture of pity and admiration. "You played your game well, and yet you miscalculated one thing." "What is that?" "The cost. You are clever, Mr. Tolliver, but vengeance is a flame that consumes even the hand that kindles it. You have gained no peace, and you never will." Tolliver rose, trembling. "You will expose me, then?" Holmes shook his head. "No. The law punishes deeds, not designs. You have committed no crime that can be proved, but I suggest that you leave England, and with haste. Justice, as you have learned, has a way of returning to those who think they command it." The solicitor bowed his head. Without another word, he turned and left. The door closed softly behind him. For a long time, Holmes did not speak. The firelight flickered across his sharp features, lending some a sculpted gravity. At last, he said, "So ends the affair, Watson. The final hand was not fate's, but man's, guided by reason, warped by passion. A chain of vengeance forged from one falsehood and broken only when its maker stood alone among the ruins." I nodded. "Do you think he will truly leave the country?" "He will leave," Holmes replied, "but peace will not go with him." He poured himself a measure of brandy and leaned back. "Mark my words, Watson. This case will trouble me longer than most. We have seen how easily justice and retribution change masks. The difference between them lies only in whose hand holds the scales." He raised his glass slightly toward the fire. "To the ghosts of Cawnpore," he said quietly. may they rest at last. And there, amid the crackle of the hearth and the muted hum of London beyond our windows, the long shadow that had begun with the soldiers' quarrel in India finally slipped into silence. The days that followed Mr. Tolliver's departure were marked by an unusual stillness in Baker Street. The great case, whose echoes had rumbled from the plains of India to the heart of London, seemed finally laid to rest. Holmes, however, was not a man easily content with silence. His mind, deprived of its accustomed occupation, grew restless, and I soon perceived that he was wrestling inwardly with thoughts unspoken. He spent long hours at his desk, examining the remains of the correspondence connected with the Fanshawe affair, now neatly tied and labelled in his precise hand. From time to time, he would lift a single paper, study it in silence, then replace it with a sigh. One morning, as the fog drifted thick against the panes, he said abruptly, "Watson, have you ever reflected how seldom truth grants satisfaction? We have traced this matter to its very root, each thread examined, each actor unmasked, and yet there remains a sense of incompletion, as though justice itself had left us a step behind." I set down my cup of coffee. "You are thinking of Tolliver." "Precisely. A man who believed himself the instrument of righteousness, yet became the very thing he despised. It is one of life's most insidious ironies, my dear fellow. I find myself wondering whether the evil in this world lies in crime itself, or in the motives that clothe it in virtue." "Surely, Holmes," I said, "his motives, though misguided, were not entirely base. He sought to vindicate his uncle's name." Holmes's thin lips curved faintly. "The path to perdition, Watson, is paved with such vindications. He avenged a wrong, yes, but he also struck the spark that lit 4 pyres: Fanshawe, Graves, Lansing, Brent. Each man fell to a death prepared by Tolliver's hand. It is a grim account, and one that will not rest easily on my conscience." He rose suddenly, restless as ever. "I think we shall hear of him again. Men who play Providence seldom retire from the trade without one last move." His prophecy was fulfilled more swiftly than either of us anticipated. 3 days later, a telegram arrived from the British consulate in Calais. Holmes opened it, read, and passed it silently to me. "Tolliver found dead in his hotel room early this morning. Cause uncertain. Papers in his possession request delivery to Mr. Sherlock Holmes, London." Holmes's expression did not change. So, the curtain descends upon the last actor. The irony is complete. By that afternoon, the papers had reached Baker Street in the custody of a courier. They consisted chiefly of letters and diaries. Holmes examined them briefly, then withdrew a small folded envelope bearing his name. He broke the seal and read aloud, "My dear Mr. Holmes, if you are reading this, I have met the peace that eluded me in life. I go willingly. I have written much of justice and wrongs, but it was you, sir, who showed me the face of truth. I was a fool to think I could balance those scales myself. Do with these papers as you see fit. They contain the whole of my confession. Let the world judge me or forget me as it will. Yours sincerely, Geoffrey Tolliver." Holmes folded the letter carefully and set it aside. He writes of confession. Let us see what shadow it conceals. We passed that evening amid the rustle of old papers. Tolliver's handwriting, neat and exact, filled page after page with his account of the scheme by which he had manipulated the tragedy. It began with his discovery, 2 years earlier, of Haldane's forgotten correspondence, letters that proved the innocence of his uncle and the guilt of the officers who had condemned him. He wrote, "I swore an oath before those faded pages that I would not rest until every man who had profited by that falsehood had paid. I chose my weapons with care, knowledge, patience, and the frailty of human conscience. Fanshaw's fear of ghosts, Graves's debt, Brent's remorse, all these I turned to my purpose. The letter to Miss Fanshawe was the first move. I knew that by summoning you, Holmes, I would ensure that truth, once set in motion, could not be stopped. I was the hand that wound the clock. You were the pendulum that struck the hour." Holmes read this passage aloud and sat long without speaking. The firelight played upon his angular features, casting deep shadows beneath his eyes. "So," he said softly, "the puppeteer pulls his strings even in confession. He imagines himself an architect of justice, and me merely his instrument. There is vanity for you, Watson, the final and most poisonous of human delusions." He turned to another page. "When Graves died, I felt no triumph, only emptiness. I had imagined that vengeance would cleanse the soul, but it leaves only ashes. Yet, even as I write these words, I know that I would do it again. For the world forgets, Mr. Holmes, and only by such reminders does it remember its sins." Holmes laid the manuscript aside. "There is the epitaph of our century, man seeking to play God and finding only himself. It is well, perhaps, that he has gone." The following morning, Holmes took the papers to Scotland Yard. Lestrade received them with evident reluctance. "A queer business, Mr. Holmes," he said. "Still, there's no law against confession after one's death. I'll file it away and pray the next case I get concerns a simple burglary." When we left the yard, Holmes seemed in better spirits. "Come, Watson," said he. "Let us walk. The air may be thick, but it will do our lungs good after this roomful of moral decay." We made our way along the embankment, where the river glimmered like tarnished steel beneath the gas lamps. Presently, Holmes stopped and leaned upon the railing, gazing down at the sluggish water. "Do you know, Watson," he said, "I sometimes think that crime, like the Thames, will forever wind its way through the heart of humanity. We may dredge its depths and drag to light 1,000 corpses, but its current runs on unchanged. Men will lie, steal, kill, not always for gain, but for pride, for love, for the illusion of justice. And yet, it is our duty to wade in after them." He smiled faintly. "The work, my dear fellow, will never end, and perhaps that is just as well, for it keeps us from the far graver crime of idleness." We turned back toward Baker Street. The lamps flickered, the fog thickened, and the faint rattle of carriage wheels echoed along the Strand. Somewhere in the distance, Big Ben tolled the hour, slow, solemn, inexorable. Holmes drew his coat closer. "Another case closed, Watson," he murmured. "And yet, as ever, the mystery that endures is man himself." Thus, the long shadow of the Fanshawe affair faded at last into memory. But to those who knew Sherlock Holmes, it was clear that, in some quiet recess of his extraordinary mind, the ghost of Geoffrey Tolliver still lingered. Another name inscribed in that secret ledger of human folly, which no fire, not even that of Baker Street, could ever wholly consume. The months slipped by in their accustomed fashion, with Holmes immersed in the intricate web of London's endless intrigues, and I, as ever, his chronicler and companion. Yet I knew that the case of Colonel Fanshawe had left its mark upon him more deeply than he would ever confess. At times, I would find him standing before the window of our sitting room, his gaze fixed upon the smoke-hung city beyond, his lean fingers drumming softly upon the sill, a sure sign that his thoughts were far away, tangled in those secret reflections which only the most complex of cases could awaken. It was in the early spring of that year that a new development, unforeseen and most curious, drew the curtain back upon the very affair we believed concluded. The post had just been delivered when Holmes uttered an exclamation and held up a thin foreign envelope, the seal marked with the crest of the British consulate in Florence. "From Miss Fanshawe," he said briefly, tearing it open. His eyes scanned the page, and I observed that faint tightening of the jaw which always preceded his utmost concentration. "Watson," said he at last, "our peace is to be short-lived. The dead are not yet done with us." He handed me the letter. It was written in a graceful, steady hand. "Mr. Holmes, forgive my troubling you once more, but a matter has arisen here which bears, I fear, some connection to my uncle's history. A gentleman lately arrived in Florence has made inquiries concerning Colonel Fanshawe's death and the papers you recovered. He presents himself as a historian, but there is something in his manner that fills me with dread. He spoke too of Captain Haldane, and hinted that the full story of Cawnpore is not yet told. I beg that you will advise me, for I confess I feel once again the old shadow at my door. Yours faithfully, Clara Fanshawe." Holmes read the letter again aloud, his tone measured and grave. "A historian, eh? A convenient profession for a spy or blackmailer. Watson, I think we must prepare for a journey." 2 days later, we arrived in Florence, that city of sun and shadow. The air was scented with almond blossoms, and the Arno glittered beneath its ancient bridges. Yet even amid such beauty, there lurked unease. Miss Fanshawe received us at her lodgings in the Via della Scala, a modest yet charming villa overlooking a quiet courtyard. She was paler than when I had last seen her, but her eyes retained that same dignity and resolve which had first impressed me. "I was almost afraid you would not come," she said, pressing Holmes's hand. "The gentleman of whom I wrote has grown more persistent. He calls himself Mr. Adrian Haldane." Holmes started. "Haldane? Then the circle closes indeed. The captain's son, perhaps?" "Yes," she replied. "He claims to be so. He has sought me out 3 times already, urging me to surrender my uncle's papers, which I never possessed. When I refused, he grew agitated and swore that England had suppressed the truth of his father's death." Holmes's expression hardened. "Then we must see this Mr. Haldane. Where is he lodged?" "At the Pensione d'Inghilterra, near the Piazza Santa Maria Novella." "Excellent. Watson, we shall pay him a call this afternoon." When we reached the Pensione, we found the so-called historian in his sitting room, a man of perhaps 40, tall, bronzed, and strikingly like the faded portrait of Captain Haldane, which Holmes had once shown me. His manner was courteous yet restless, and his eyes burned with a smouldering intensity that betrayed a nature ruled more by passion than reason. "Mr. Holmes of Baker Street," he exclaimed when we announced ourselves. "I have long desired to meet the man whose name is synonymous with truth. You are acquainted, I believe, with the tragedy of my father." Holmes inclined his head. "I am acquainted with it, and also with the web of deception that surrounded it. Haldane's jaw tightened. Then you know that the official account was a lie. My father was murdered, falsely accused and buried in shame. I have proofs, Mr. Holmes. Letters, witnesses, even one living man who can tell you what truly passed that night at Cawnpore. Holmes's keen gaze never wavered. And this man, who is he? A native soldier who served under my father. He lives now in Cairo. I intend to publish the full story to expose the conspiracy that ruined his name. But first, I must have the papers found at Blackthorn Lodge. Without them, I cannot prove the link. Holmes's tone was cool. Those papers are in the custody of the British government, Mr. Haldane. I doubt they will be yielded to any private hand. Then I shall take them, cried the man fiercely. By heaven, I will. The world shall hear my father's truth, even if I must drag it from the grave. Holmes regarded him steadily. Vengeance seems an inherited malady in your family, sir. Believe me when I say that the past, once unearthed, seldom lies still. Haldane's features darkened. Are you warning me, Mr. Holmes, or threatening? I warn no man, said Holmes quietly. I merely state the law of consequences. We left him pacing the floor, his hands clenched behind his back. In the street outside, Holmes said, He is not a villain, Watson, merely the echo of one. The sins of fathers indeed. But I fear that his zeal may drive him to acts which he himself will rue. That night we dined with Miss Fanshawe. The warm Italian air drifted through the open windows, carrying the faint music of a distant mandolin. Yet even amid that tranquil scene, Holmes's manner was alert, watchful. Once he rose suddenly and crossed to the window. Watson, he said in a low voice, observe the shadow by the fountain. We are watched. I peered out. A figure stood motionless in the gloom of the courtyard. A tall man, his features indistinct. The moment he saw us looking, he turned and vanished down the street. Holmes closed the shutters and returned to his chair. The play continues. I think Mr. Haldane is not acting alone. There are others, perhaps men who profit by stirring these old scandals anew. The following morning proved his words true. As we prepared to leave for a meeting at the British consulate, a servant rushed in with startling news. Mr. Haldane had been found dead in his room at the pensione. The cause, the innkeeper said, was poison. Holmes's face grew grave. So, the final page is turned once more. Come, Watson. We must see the scene before rumour makes a tangle of it. We reached the pensione to find the local police already present. Haldane lay upon his bed, fully dressed, a small glass upon the table beside him. There was no sign of struggle. Holmes examined the body swiftly, and then the glass. Hydrocyanic acid, he murmured. Instantaneous. Yet note, there are no stains upon the lips, no odour strong enough to suggest deliberate ingestion. You mean that he was murdered, Watson, by the same hand that slew Colonel Fanshawe? Look here, a candle burnt halfway. The old device again, adapted for travel. Someone feared what Haldane might reveal. He turned to the inspector. Send word to London. Tell them the ghost of Cawnpore walks again. That evening, as we looked out upon the dark River Arno, Holmes said softly, I thought the past was buried, Watson, but it seems its grave is shallower than we supposed. The tale that began with one man's guilt has become a contagion. Mark my words, the end is yet to come. And so the peace we had imagined shattered once more, the embers of the Fanshawe affair kindling anew beneath the foreign stars. The death of Adrian Haldane struck Florence with a shock of thunder. Rumour ran like fire through the narrow streets, leaping from pensione to cafe, until his name was upon every tongue. The local police, eager to preserve the reputation of their city, were quick to declare it suicide, citing the empty glass and the troubled mind of the deceased. Yet Holmes, whose eyes had read death in too many guises, dismissed that verdict at a glance. "No man drinks poison in a bed freshly turned down," he said grimly, standing beside the motionless form. "There are small signs which speak more loudly than words. Observe the faint wax upon the nightstand, the shadow of a candle removed, and the open shutters. Our murderer is a creature of habit, Watson, and habit is the surest betrayer of all." The inspector, a florid fellow named D'Angelo, shrugged with continental indifference. "Perhaps he lighted a candle to write his last letter, Signor. We found one unfinished." Holmes took the sheet and read. It bore only a few disjointed words. "Forgive me. Truth. Too late. My father." The rest was a blur, the ink smeared by a damp hand. Holmes handed it back without comment. "This letter," he said quietly, "is genuine despair, not confession. No man writes of forgiveness when bent upon vengeance." He was silenced, not repentant. That evening we returned to Miss Fanshawe, who awaited us in her dim parlour, the lamplight catching the pale gleam of her gown. She rose as we entered. "You have seen him, then?" she asked in a whisper. "Yes," said Holmes, "and I regret to tell you he met the same end as your uncle. It is not coincidence, Miss Fanshawe, but continuation." She covered her face with her hands. "Will it never end?" Holmes's tone softened. "It shall, madam. I promise you that. But I must beg your assistance. Think carefully. Had Mr. Haldane any visitor, anyone who came to him of late besides ourselves?" She looked up, recalling. "Only one. A gentleman who called himself Mr. Gray, a thin man, English, quiet-spoken. He said he was a friend of Mr. Haldane's father, and that he bore him certain letters from India. He came the evening before Mr. Haldane's death." Holmes's eyes flashed. Gray? A name too colourless not to be false. "Tell me, did you see him yourself?" "Only as he left. He wore a black cloak and gloves despite the warmth. His eyes were pale, cold as steel." "Watson," said Holmes, rising, "the ghost we hunt has flesh after all." He paced the room in thought. A man of English speech, familiar with Indian devices and versed in poison. He kills with a candle. First Fanshawe, then Haldane. The method is identical. The same hand set both traps. But whose? Graves and Brent are dead. Tolliver, too. Only one name remains unaccounted for. One man who profited from all and was never touched by the law. "You mean?" "Sir Lionel Graves," said Holmes quietly. "He was reported dead after his arrest, yet the body was buried without identification. It was said he took ill in prison. I begin to think he took freedom instead. We lost no time." By dawn the following morning, Holmes had secured the cooperation of the British consulate and traced a recent arrival at the Florence Railway Hotel who had travelled under the name of Mr. Gray. The description matched Sir Lionel to the letter. At noon, we stood in the dim lobby of that establishment, the manager bowing and gesturing toward the staircase. "He has not yet risen, Signor Holmes, though I sent him breakfast an hour ago. Room number 12. Holmes's voice was low. "Remain here, Watson, until I call." He ascended the stairs silently. 5 minutes passed. 10. Then came the faintest sound, a soft cry, quickly stifled. I rushed upward, revolver drawn. The door of number 12 stood ajar. Within, Holmes knelt beside a man sprawled across the carpet, a man whose face was white as chalk, the lips drawn back in a ghastly rictus. Beside him, a candle burned low upon the table. "Sir Lionel," I gasped. Holmes rose slowly. The same. He sought to light another's death, and the flame turned upon him. He had prepared the poisoned candle for Miss Fanshawe, doubtless intending to deliver it as a gift of reconciliation. But by some mischance, perhaps a trembling hand or a moment's forgetfulness, he lit it himself. He gestured toward the table. There lay a small parcel wrapped in brown paper, addressed in elegant script, to Miss Clara Fanshawe, with the respectful regards of an old friend. Holmes extinguished the candle with a steady hand. "Thus ends the last of them," he said softly. "The circle closes at last." Later, as we walked along the Arno, the sun breaking through the morning mist, he spoke again. "You see, Watson, the pattern was inevitable. Each crime bore the seed of the next. Fanshawe's lie begot Tolliver's vengeance. Tolliver's vengeance awoke Graves's fury. Graves's sin bred Haldane's despair. And at the end, vengeance devoured itself. The design was perfect in its horror, like a serpent consuming its own tail. And Miss Fanshawe? She will be free of this shadow at last. I shall see to it that Sir Lionel's death is reported as accident. The less said of the past, the kinder for the living." He paused upon the bridge, watching the sunlight shimmer on the water. "It is curious, Watson, how the world mistakes justice for balance. Men speak of settling accounts, yet every stroke of retribution adds a new debt. The moral universe, like the physical, does not stand still. It circles endlessly, each motion answering another. I ventured to say, 'You have brought closure to a tragedy, Holmes. That is no small comfort.' He smiled faintly. 'Closure, perhaps, but comfort, no. When one has seen how hatred moves from father to son like a disease of the blood, one can take little pride in diagnosis. Still, it is something to have stopped its final contagion.' That evening, we dined with Miss Fanshawe before our departure for England. She received us with a composure that only heightened her beauty, though her eyes were weary with gratitude and sorrow. 'You have given me back peace, Mr. Holmes,' she said softly. 'Though the past cannot be undone, it has at least been silenced.' Holmes inclined his head. 'Truth, Miss Fanshawe, is the only peace that lasts. Guard it, but do not dwell upon it.' When she had withdrawn, he turned to me. 'Watson, do you remember the Colonel's first letter, the one that began this unhappy tale? He wrote, "The past does not sleep." He was right, you know. It sleeps only when all who dreamed it are gone.' We left Florence the next morning. As our train wound northward through the Tuscan hills, Holmes sat by the window, his sharp profile etched against the golden light. He did not speak for some time. At last, he said quietly, "There are moments, my dear Watson, when I envy the dullest of men. They live without seeing the pattern beneath the surface, without hearing the echo of deeds long buried. For them, a candle is only a candle. For us, it is the sum of all that men call justice and all that they call sin." He smiled faintly and leaned back. "And yet," he murmured, "what would the world do without a little light?" The rhythmic beat of the train carried us homeward, and as London's familiar smoke welcomed us once again, I could not help but think that, for Sherlock Holmes, the pursuit of truth would never end. not while there was shadow enough in the world to cast against his ceaseless flame.